Imagine you're a settler on the frontier. The night is quiet, the land stretching endless around you. Then, out of nowhere, the silence is broken. Hoofbeats, war cries, and by the time you react, they're already on you. For centuries, the Great Plains and the Southwest were ruled by fearsome warriors. The Comanche, lightning on horseback, unmatched in speed and ferocity. The Sioux, who crushed Custer's forces at Little Bighorn. The Apache, masters of guerrilla warfare, impossible to track, impossible to stop. They were fighters. They were the dominant force. Empires feared them. Armies fell before them. Settlers called them ruthless because they had to be. History calls them obstacles to civilization. But the truth? They were survivors, tacticians, the last defense of a world being stolen from them. But how did they rise? What made them unstoppable? And what finally brought them down? My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Let's begin with a tribe that was feared by all. The Comanche. The Comanche were war itself. They were unabating, brutal, and unmatched on horseback. For nearly 2 centuries, they ruled the southern Great Plains, striking fear into settlers, soldiers, and rival tribes. By the early 1700s, they had pushed the Apache off the plains, claiming huge lands from Texas to Colorado. The Spanish called it Comancheria, Comanche country, but no one controlled it. The Comanche mastered the horse, moving with unmatched speed and precision. They fired arrows at full gallop and vanished into the prairie like ghosts. They raided and they destroyed. Settlements fell, men were killed, and captives were taken. Some were adopted, others sold, and many never returned. And as European settlers pushed west, they met an enemy who fought without mercy. The Comanche turned trade routes into battlegrounds, stole thousands of horses, and forced governments to negotiate on their terms. But power came at a cost. Once part of the Shoshone, they had moved south, driven by hunger, first for bison, then horses, then dominance. For over a century, they had it. Then the world changed. Texas rose, firearms spread, and the U.S. Army arrived. By the mid-1800s, disease, starvation, and relentless military campaigns broke them. The Comanche who had ruled the plains were forced onto reservations. Their reign was over, but for those who had faced them at their peak, one thing was certain. The Comanche were the storm. In their prime, the Comanche had no friends, only trading partners, enemies, and targets. They played both sides, dealing in horses, weapons, and captives with New Mexico's Comancheros while launching ferocious raids against Texas settlers. To the Spanish, Mexicans, and later Americans, they were both valuable and terrifying, useful allies one day, merciless raiders the next. And they weren't just at war with outsiders. They clashed with nearly every tribe on the southern plains, using sheer force to carve out their dominance. The Spanish and Americans tried to manipulate these rivalries, but the Comanche were too unpredictable, too dangerous to control. Warfare was indeed their way of life. They perfected fighting on horseback, turning the open plains into their battleground. When the Comanche moon rose full and bright, they struck deep into Mexico, covering hundreds of miles to steal horses, take captives, and leave settlements in flames. The 1840s saw some of their bloodiest raids, reaching as far south as Durango and Zacatecas, devastating entire regions before vanishing into the night. Spanish, Mexican, and American armies all tried to break them. None succeeded, not at first. The Comanche fought with unmatched fury, defending Comancheria against every invader. But war alone wasn't what brought them down. The settlers kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. Disease swept through the Comanche like wildfire, killing more than any bullet or blade. The empire they had built on horseback began to crack. But even in decline, they were warriors to the core. For the Comanche, war was identity. Every raid, every battle, every captive taken reinforced their power. To fight was to prove oneself. To kill was to dominate. And to endure suffering was to show unshakable strength. Captives faced two possible fates. Women and children were often absorbed into the tribe, raised as Comanche, sometimes by choice, sometimes by force. Many grew so deeply into their new lives that they refused to leave even when given the chance. By the way, if you want the full story of the woman who survived 21 months as a Comanche captive, watch our detailed episode now. Meanwhile, male warriors weren't so lucky. They were trophies, their pain a test of their captor's power. The Comanche had no use for the weak. Those who broke under torture died in agony. Those who endured earned a grim respect, but rarely mercy. And it wasn't cruelty for the sake of it. This was their way, a code as old as war itself. Strength ruled the plains, and the Comanche made sure no one ever forgot it. Every raid, every ambush, every brutal act had a purpose. Send a message, instill fear, and keep outsiders away. Violence was tactical. The more terrifying their reputation, the fewer enemies would dare challenge them. To settlers and soldiers, Comanche warfare seemed like pure savagery. To the Comanche, it was survival. If you rode into Comanche land, you weren't guaranteed to ride out. By the 1840s, tensions between the Comanche and Texan settlers had reached a boiling point. Raids were constant, captives were taken. Texas officials wanted peace, on their terms. So they invited Comanche leaders to San Antonio for negotiations. It was a trap. On March 19, 1840, 65 Comanches, 33 chiefs and warriors, along with women and children, entered the council house. They brought one captive, Matilda Lockhart, a teenage girl, scarred and broken from brutal treatment. The Texans expected all captives to be returned. The Comanche, following their own system, explained that others were held by different bands. But that wasn't good enough. Texan officials declared they would hold the chiefs until every last captive was freed. The Comanche refused. Words turned to violence. The fight erupted inside the building. Knives, tomahawks, pistols, chaos. By the end, 35 Comanches lay dead, including women and children. 7 Texans were killed. The massacre shattered any chance of peace. The Comanche didn't just respond, they retaliated with fury. Led by Buffalo Hump, they launched the Great Raid of 1840, one of the largest assaults on Texas settlements. Towns burned, settlers were slaughtered, and hundreds of horses were taken. Victoria and Linville were wiped off the map. Texas had made its move. The Comanche answered with fire and blood. Then, by the late 1850s, Texas had enough. Comanche raids had turned frontier life into a nightmare. The settlers wanted revenge. They sent their best hunters, Captain John Rip Ford and his Texas Rangers. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They studied Comanche tactics, fought like Comanches, and now they had a new weapon, the Colt revolver. So, in May 1858, Ford led his men deep into Comancheria, hunting their enemy on their own turf. The Rangers struck hard at Little Robe Creek, ambushing a Comanche village in what is now Oklahoma. This time, the Comanche weren't the ones launching a surprise attack. They were on the receiving end. Caught off guard, they fought back fiercely, but the Rangers had an edge. Their revolvers fired faster than the Comanche bows. The battle turned into a slaughter. It was a turning point. The Comanche still ruled the plains, but the tide had shifted. Firearms, uncompromising military campaigns, and growing numbers of settlers were closing in. The empire they had built on horseback, terror, and dominance was beginning to crack. For a time, they had been the undisputed lords of the Great Plains. But the world was changing, and even the Comanche couldn't outride it forever. By the late 1860s, the U.S. crushed Comanche resistance. The 1867 Treaty of Medicine Lodge took their land with false promises. Buffalo hunters destroyed the herds, causing starvation. In 1874, Isatai's attack on adobe walls failed. The U.S. Army then wiped out the last fighters in the Red River War, destroying their horses and supplies at Palo Duro Canyon. With no buffalo, they couldn't survive. In 1875, Quanah Parker surrendered. The Comanche, once rulers of the plains, were defeated. They were now prisoners of a world they had fought to the bitter end. Beyond the southern plains, however, another story unfolded. The Sioux? The Sioux were another dominating tribe. They rose from the forests of Minnesota and the Mississippi Valley, conquering and adapting. Before they ruled the plains, their ancestors, the Blackduck Cathio Clam River culture, roamed the Northwoods. By 1300 A.D., they formed the Seven Council Fires, Ochethi Shakowing, a powerful alliance. In the 1600s, the Dakota, near the Great Lakes, held firm until the Iroquois, armed with European muskets, pushed them west. The Lakota seized the moment, moving onto the plains just as horses arrived. They mastered them, becoming cavalry warriors. Meanwhile, disease and war battered the Dakota as tribes fleeing the Iroquois clashed with them. By the late 1600s, the Dakota allied with the French for guns and trade power, but trust was fragile. When the French favored the Ojibwe, war erupted in the 1720s. The Dakota lost key lands and retreated south, burning for revenge. And in 1736, Sioux warriors massacred Jean-Baptiste de la Vérendrye's men. The French tried to broker peace, but conflict never ceased. When France lost North America in 1763, the Sioux adapted once more, relying on horses, weapons, and their warrior code. Then, in 1770, the Dakota and Meskwaki attacked the Ojibwe at the St. Croix Dale. Confident, the Meskwaki led the charge, but Ojibwe reinforcements turned the tide. The Dakota were driven into the river, their forces shattered. The Ojibwe claimed the upper St. Croix, while the Dakota held the south. Meanwhile, the Sioux were evolving. The Lakota had moved west, adapting to the life of the plains, shaping a warrior culture built on speed, skill, and the horse. The Dakota, on the other hand, stayed closer to the woods, holding on to their traditional ways. By 1803, the Sioux had divided into three distinct branches: Eastern Dakota, Western Dakota, and Lakota. But their bond, their warrior code, remained unbroken. And by the mid-19th century, the Sioux had become legends of the battlefield. With the horse came power. By the 1850s, the Lakota were kings of the northern plains, their influence stretching far and wide. Two fights defined their reputation: the Fetterman Fight of 1866 and the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. Both proved one thing: the Sioux were master tacticians, fearless and impossible to break. But settlers kept coming, pushing westward, cutting through sacred hunting grounds. Then came the Bozeman Trail, a road slicing straight through Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho lands. The U.S. Army built forts to protect the trail, but those forts were nothing more than targets. Fort Phil Kearny, deep in present-day Wyoming, became the center of the storm. Red Cloud and Crazy Horse led a relentless campaign against it, striking supply trains, hitting woodcutting crews, keeping the soldiers inside on edge. Their goal was to lure the enemy out, make them arrogant, make them reckless. It worked. One man, Captain William J. Fetterman, took the bait. A Civil War veteran, he believed the Sioux were nothing more than a nuisance. He bragged, "Give me 80 men, and I can ride through the whole Sioux nation." He was about to learn the hard way that the Sioux were hunters, and he had just walked into their trap. December 21st, 1866, Fort Phil Kearny. The alarm is raised. Captain William Fetterman, eager for glory, leads 81 soldiers, infantry and cavalry, out of the fort. His orders are clear: do not cross Lodge Trail Ridge. But he does. Waiting for him is Crazy Horse, leading a small decoy force. The bait is set. Fetterman bites. He chases them over the ridge, into the Pino Valley, straight into the mouth of an ambush. Over 1,000 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors rise from the landscape like ghosts. The fight was brutal and short. Trapped, outnumbered, and cut down with heartless efficiency, Fetterman and all his men die where they stand. The U.S. Army suffers its worst defeat on the plains until Custer's last stand a decade later. By the 1870s, tension burns hotter. The Black Hills, sacred Sioux land, is crawling with gold-hungry miners. The U.S. government breaks its own treaties, demanding the Sioux give up the land. The Sioux refuse. War is coming. June 25, 1876, Little Bighorn River, Montana. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer rides in with the 7th Cavalry. He thinks he's facing a small band of warriors. He's wrong. The Sioux, joined by the Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho, number in the thousands. Leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse have gathered them for one purpose: war. Custer splits his regiment into 3 groups, expecting an easy victory. His command of 210 men moves in without waiting for reinforcements. The Sioux strike like lightning. The battlefield erupts into chaos. Within hours, Custer and every last man under his command are dead. It was the most crushing defeat the U.S. military has ever suffered at native hands. But victory is short-lived. The U.S. government doubles down, flooding the plains with troops. The Sioux fight, but the war is unwinnable. But what really happened that day? Discover the untold accounts from 7 Sioux witnesses in our special hour-long episode. Moving on. By the 1880s, the great Sioux nation is wrecked, forced onto reservations, and the land keeps shrinking. The 1887 Dawes Act carved up their land, forcing them into private ownership and a foreign way of life. The goal was clear: erase Sioux identity through assimilation. By 1889, statehood movements in the Dakotas demanded more land. Congress ignored Sioux leaders and broke the Great Sioux Reservation into 5 smaller pieces. Protests meant nothing. The land was taken. The Dawes Act also banned native traditions, enforcing Euro-American laws. Cultural practices were criminalized, and native courts imposed foreign rules. Schools stripped children of their identity, forcing them to forget their heritage. By the 1920s, the Sioux had lost hundreds of thousands of acres. The Sioux had won battles, but laws and broken promises were taking everything left. The North had fallen silent, but in the South, the fight was far from over. The Apache. The Apache were not one tribe, but many, fierce, nomadic warriors spread across the Southwest, from Arizona to Texas into Mexico's frontier. They didn't build cities. They didn't farm like the Pueblo. They moved like ghosts through the desert and mountains, striking without warning and disappearing before the dust settled. The Spanish feared them. The Mexicans put bounties on their scalps. The U.S. Army, with all its guns and numbers, learned the hard way. Apache did not break. For centuries they fought. The Spanish first recorded them in 1541, calling them dog nomads, watching as they roamed the plains, hunting bison, drinking their blood for strength. They lived in skin tents, packed everything onto dogs, and followed the herds untied to land, bound only to survival. By the 1600s, Apache and Spanish settlers fell into an uneasy rhythm, raiding and trading, sometimes at war, sometimes at peace. Treaties meant nothing. One village might welcome Apache as allies, while another burned under their torches. But by the 1700s, Mexico had had enough. Apache raids bled Sonora and Chihuahua dry. So the Mexican government set a price: Apache scalps for silver. The blood bounty ignited a war that would last generations. In 1837, Apache leader Juan José Compa was slaughtered for money. The revenge came swift and brutal. Mangas Coloradas, or red sleeves, rose in his place. He was a giant of a man, brutal and cunning. Beside him stood Black Knife, who was also carving out vengeance in blood. They burned settlements. They ambushed soldiers. They tore through northern Mexico, leaving bodies in their wake. The message was clear: Apache would not be hunted like animals. When the U.S. arrived in the 19th century, they met an enemy unlike any other. Apache warriors moved in small bands, striking at supply lines, baiting troops into dead-end canyons. They fought the way the land taught them: swift, vicious, and impossible to pin down. For nearly 4 decades, 1849 to 1886, the Apache fought like shadows against the U.S. military. This wasn't war in neat battle lines. This was survival. Cruel raids, fierce ambushes, and the kind of guerrilla warfare that made generals tear their hair out. The Apache didn't fight fair. They fought to win. It started with the Mexican-American War. In 1848, the U.S. took the Southwest, swallowing up Apache land without a second thought. Settlers poured in, fueled by gold fever and manifest destiny. The Apache had seen it before, first the Spanish, then the Mexicans, now the Americans. The response was the same: raid, resist, disappear into the mountains. The U.S. Army came hard. Troops marched into Apache territory, determined to crush them. But the Apache knew the land better. They used the canyons, the deserts, the forests, striking fast, slipping away before the soldiers could react. Villages burned, soldiers died in their sleep. The Army called it savagery. The Apache called it war. By 1856, the death toll was staggering. In Durango alone, native raids, mostly Apache and Comanche, had left nearly 6,000 dead, hundreds kidnapped, and entire settlements wiped off the map. Then came Geronimo. Born Goyacla, or one who yawns, he had no reason for mercy. In 1851, Mexican soldiers slaughtered his family, leaving him with nothing but rage. From that moment, he lived for revenge. He led raids deep into Mexico, striking at soldiers and settlers alike. They hunted him, but he slipped through their fingers every time. His warriors moved in small bands, hitting supply lines, ambushing patrols, then vanishing into the wilderness. The Battle of Apache Pass in 1862 was a turning point. The U.S. Army wanted control of a vital water source in Arizona. However, the Apache, led by Mangas Coloradas and Cochise, weren't about to give it up. The fighting was savage, a desperate stand in the sun-baked canyons. The Army had something new: mountain howitzers, cannons that turned natural defenses into death trap. And for the first time, the Apache were forced to retreat. But surrender wasn't in their blood. The war raged on. The Union Army moved through the pass, marching toward New Mexico. General James H. Carleton led the column, but the land did not belong to him. It belonged to the Apache. Mangas Coloradas and Cochise knew the terrain like the lines in their own hands. They took the high ground, hidden among the rocks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then they attacked. Apache warriors hit from above, forcing the soldiers into chaos. They used the canyons, the ridges, the dust, striking fast and disappearing before bullets could find them. But this time, the Union's howitzers turned the tide of battle. Explosions ripped through the battlefield, sending rock and fire into the Apache lines. The Apache warriors, unfamiliar with such weapons, were forced back. They had fought with everything, but the enemy had firepower they had never seen. But still, the Apache weren't finished. In the 1870s and 1880s, Geronimo took the fight underground, leading breakouts, vanishing into the mountains, raiding, retreating, and doing it all again. He had only small bands of warriors, but he made entire regiments chase ghosts. They called him a fugitive, but he was a warrior, holding on to his way of life. The Sierra Madre became his battlefield. No one knew the land better. No one ran harder, fought longer, or slipped through the enemy's grasp more times than he did. The U.S. Army grew desperate. They sent thousands of soldiers after him, tracking him day and night. Still, he moved faster. Still, he fought. But in the end, it wasn't bullets or battle that ended the Apache resistance. It was exhaustion. In 1886, outnumbered and outgunned, Geronimo surrendered at Skeleton Canyon. His group, 30 to 50 men, women, and children, had held off an army of 5,000. The Apache War was over. The Army shipped them off to Florida, then Oklahoma, locking them away as prisoners of war. Even the Chiricahua scouts who tracked Geronimo were betrayed, exiled with him. The worst betrayal came in 1875. The U.S. forced 1,500 Yavapai and Tonto Apache off their promised land. Treaties meant nothing. Soldiers marched them 180 miles through freezing rivers and mountains. Hundreds died. Survivors were locked in San Carlos for 25 years while settlers took their land. Buffalo soldiers guarded them, but the Apache still fought. In 1879, Chief Victorio led his warriors in another war, another betrayal. Geronimo's surrender didn't end it. Apache children were stolen, forced into white adoption to erase their culture. The war ended on paper, but the fight never stopped. Geronimo's story is one of resilience and defiance. We covered it in detail. Watch our 3-hour episode on our channel. And so, the Comanche ruled the plains, the Sioux crushed empires, and the Apache never surrendered. These fearsome tribes changed history, defied armies, and became legends. Guns, disease, and numbers won the war, but their spirit remains. And this was Wild America.